This is a podcast about our lived experience, which unfortunately includes infant death and subsequent mental health struggles. Please take good care of yourself and only listen if this content feels safe for you right now. We'll still be here when you're ready.
Hi, I'm Judith.
And I'm Alina. We both lost babies to SIDS in winter 2021.
In the throes of grief, I reached out to a stranger on the internet and our friendship was born.
In the years since, we've been working hard to survive, rebuild, and navigate the continual challenges that have come our way, including divorce,
Job loss,
dating while bereaved,
moving multiple times,
health scares,
pregnancy and parenting a living child,
starting new jobs, and so much more.
We are tired.
Happily ever after is out of the question for us, but this podcast documents our journeys to happier ever after because we believe life after loss is worth living.
So join us as we laugh, cry until we laugh.
Welcome to As Long as I'm Living podcast.
We're so glad you're here.
Hello, welcome to As Long as I'm Living podcast. This is Alina, Quinn's mom. This week's episode is a continuation of our interview with Dr. Rabbi Antine, so if you missed last week's episode, you should go back and listen to that first. It's linked in the description. And with that, I'll send you into the episode with Rabbi Antine.
I'll tell you, when Aiden died that morning, he died overnight, and I found him in his pack and play in the morning, and I called my parents, and my parents came over, and then the first thing my mom did was call the rabbi, which I thought was like a very odd decision. Like it would not have occurred to me, but I can imagine that you're on the receiving end of these phone calls, and you're walking into what some would call a nightmare. You're walking into people's worst day of their life. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about, from your experience, what does it feel like to be walking into the worst day of someone's life? And like, what do you view your role as there? Like, what was that rabbi? I can tell you what he did do, but what do you think you're supposed to be doing? And who teaches, like, is there a guideline? Did you get that? Did you learn that in school? Like,
right. You are a first responder almost in the same way that a paramedic is. You're the religious first responder.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm always amazed in many of these situations. Like sometimes I'll get a call from somebody that so-and-so died, and they're like, let's say from the spouse, and they're like, I haven't told my kids yet. Like, I mean, they haven't told the children yet. And they called me before they called, so that I know about the death before like the actual mourners. And it happens more often than it's not just a rare occurrence. And well, first of all, sometimes they want guidance on how to tell their loved ones.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very interesting how whenever these things happen, I think they're not calling me Nissan Antine. They're calling the rabbi, the rabbi I represent something. I do this. It's kind of has shifted for me. When I remember when I was first started, I'm in my 18th year now being a rabbi. So when I first started, I remember my first year there was a suicide and death by suicide in our synagogue, and I remember going over to the house, and it was in the beginning. Actually, there were two of them in my first year, like within maybe 3 or 4 months of each other. Of like. Both of them were like 18 or 19, 17 or 18, whatever.
Wow,
and
young.
Yeah. So these were children of members. So the parents called me. There was another rabbi there at the time also. And I remember going over to both of those homes. And this was in both situations, the deceased was still there. And I really remember being frightened before I walked in. I was so scared. Like, how do you walk into this situation? This is like, and I was a very young rabbi. It was very scary.
And you're an expert. You were called in as an expert.
Yeah.
Right? In something. And you're like, wait, what?
I'm 26 years old and just up in medical school. It was very scary.
The rabbi will know what to do. And you're like, wait, oh my gosh, I'm the rabbi.
But then well, so first of all, what I'm going to say is now I don't have that anymore. It's because also now I've come to realize that it's not about me and what I'm going to say. They just need somebody there who will be supportive. Sometimes just someone they need to hug, someone they need to have some grounding, some sense of normalcy. The voice that they hear in synagogue, every Shabbat, who has said something, whatever it is that brought them comfort or resonated with their hearts or souls at one point, then they need them at that point. It's not me. It's just, and so that takes away a lot of the pressure of that moment. And then really for me, it's just really going in with an open heart and open mind. And it's not about imposing my will. I'm not planning on coming in there and saying, okay, here are all the laws of what you should do exactly in this situation. I'm ready to do that if that's what they want. And some families want that because, again, they want the concrete structure at that time. That's what gives them, a sense of something to hold on to continue. But sometimes it's just listening. Sometimes it's like, based on that conversation we were just having a few minutes ago, they need actually permission to not follow some of the rules. And I do give people that a lot when I'm talking to them in those situations. So
can I give a specific example in our community? I know so when an infant dies, when a person dies, you're supposed to bury them within 24 hours, right? But when an infant dies in the United States, you're required to do an autopsy, which takes more than 24 hours. So that would be an example of something where you're saying you have to get an autopsy, even though the law says, the Jewish law says this, but the law of the land you're living in is this. So reconciling those two things, I can imagine, is something.
Yeah, and a big thing for me would be in that kind of situation would be that you, the parents, do not have to feel any sense of guilt over this. This is the law of the land. There are reasons for it. Whether we, from a Jewish legal perspective, agree with it or not, that's a whole different story. But you should, as the parent, should not feel you're going through your own grief right now. Don't feel bad about this. This is beyond your control. So that would be
the conflict of those two laws is not your problem when your baby dies.
Right. Yeah. So that's what I would say is my role there, is just to come and different time. I've done many, many different things. Sometimes I'll come and everyone's sort of sitting around and what they need is they need like some spiritual container. And sometimes I'll come and offer to sing songs, maybe it's a lot of times what I'll do, and I do this with people who die when they're 80, but I would also do this and have done this in other kinds of situations as well, of death, would be like, let's say, for instance, if it would be an infant death, and maybe I could imagine, I don't have a specific memory of doing this, but I could imagine doing something like saying, one gift that you can give your child right now is if they're so inclined, spiritually inclined in that way, is we can go through the yearly holiday cycle, and you can sing some of the songs, like the songs from Hanukkah to your baby, or you can sing the songs from Passover or Rosh Hashanah. So
you're making me cry.
That's good. My grandmother brought me Xanax, which was useful, but not. That would have been better.
Listeners, I'm literally crying at the thought of that, and this is not even my religion. I just think that's like the sweetest.
That's a really beautiful idea.
I mean, or to teach your child the Shema, to give you it, because it's not maybe not something that, which is this prayer that parents teach their children and they put them to sleep with, or also, there are prayers that we say that you can offer to give your baby who's now on this journey. We don't know what happens after death, but to give them love and comfort and support. Again, if they're going, I would want to find out. Maybe parents wouldn't want any of that. And then I would be, It's all about humility. This is not about me bringing my ideas, but I would offer those kinds of things.
Well, then, okay. So then the baby or the person dies, and then there's the funeral. Like, how do you know what to say at a funeral? You don't know all these people. Like, what? How can you comfort a group of people if you maybe? In my particular case, he was a baby. No one knew anything about him. He was just a baby, like
a COVID baby at that.
A COVID baby. So really, anyone knew anymore. But how can you connect with this person who had passed and bring comfort or eulogize if you don't know the person, or even if you do? Like, how do you see your role in that case?
Are you talking about specifically if there'd be like an infant death, or are you talking about
or just in general, like like a tragic death. Not I mean, I assume, like, let's say for an older person, you can talk to the kids and find out, tell me a little bit about this person and what was meaningful. But sometimes the situation is so shocking that no one knows what to say.
Yeah.
And you're tasked with saying something.
Right. So, I mean, in general, when I do a eulogy at a funeral, I really don't think that the rabbi's eulogy is so important. I kind of downplay it. I mean, like, I know that there are some rabbis, they'll, this is a lesson that I learned from one of my mentors. A lot of times rabbis will be the first person to give the eulogy at the funeral. And I'm like, what? This is all about the family and their relative. And so, of course, I only speak at the end, and I just, but I always have an intake meeting with the families. And this is true about any funeral. So I will sit with them and we'll talk about the person who's passed away. And that doesn't matter. And if it would be someone who was 70 or 80, then I'm sure they would have a lot of memories. If it would be a baby who died at 3 months, then we would talk about what their, whatever. I would want to let them. There's a very important concept in Judaism around Shiva. Like when you come to visit someone who is in this first 7-day period after mourning, there's a very important concept that the visitors are not supposed to start the conversation. They're not, which I take to mean they're not supposed to shape the counters of the conversation. Like sometimes people will come in and they'll have an idea of, oh, they're in so much mourning, they probably want me to distract them by talking about something else. Now, that might be true, but you don't know. Maybe they specifically really need to talk about their loved one in that moment. Maybe they're feeling that they really want to connect. And so I understand that law, that is to really try to take your cue from the grievers, those who are grieving, and find out from them how they want to talk about it and what they want to talk about. So I would ask that question of the parents, of the family. What would you like? And I can offer some suggestions. Would you like at the funeral? Obviously, baby was only a month or two. You yourself don't really know that much about the baby, although I would actually love to know what you know and what you, and I think, Judith, I think I did ask you that question when we met that time.
You did. You asked me such a beautiful question.
Yeah.
You've asked me a lot of questions. You asked me a lot of questions that no one asked. Like you asked me questions that really, like Alina said, like leaned in, that like stumped me, and that doesn't happen often. But you really asked like very pointed questions.
I hope
I lost.
So maybe that's not what
that was so refreshing. It was so wonderful. Like, I think you asked me, how have you changed since the last? And you asked me like something about being a mother, like how I mother differently. And you asked me about you asked me like very specific questions.
And I think this is clear to me. You read the room, because I don't think, from talking to you right now, I don't think you'd ask someone whose baby died that morning those same questions. But Judith is someone who has been on this journey for a while. She has a podcast about it. Like, I think those are, you don't know Judith. Well, I don't know who knows Judith better, but I probably do. But those are great questions for Judith. She would love to answer those questions. Because we talk about every single week here on As Long as I'm Living podcast. Seriously, those questions. So the fact that you asked those questions, like, it felt really good, because I think a lot of times for us, it feels like, we have this little community of people with our podcast listeners and those close friends and family who have really stayed with us in our grief. We have this kind of like safe little community where inside of it, we talk about these things explicitly in so much detail, and it just feels normal. Like, this is my life. I have a child who died. And then outside of that, there's like kind of this palatable, like elevator pitch version that we say to other people. And so when someone comes in and is open to hearing the real, not even like the whole thing, but just a piece of it, is really refreshing.
Well, my experience around people who are grieving in all different stages of life, and I would love to hear your feedback on this, is that people do want to talk about their loss. Yes. Maybe not all the time to every single person, but they want that opportunity to share. And some people don't have the opportunity to share. And there's also people who grieve in silence because they're going through things that can't even be, there's a lot there. And people really almost yearn for that opportunity to speak about it when they can. So I would err on the side of, again, without trying to impose, but I would err on the side of really trying to at least open up the possibility of enabling the people to grieve what they have lost. So when it comes to someone who dies when they're 70 or 80 years old or 90 years old, they are losing a person who was with them for all of these years and all of these experiences, and now they're not going to have that anymore. But when you're grieving a 2 or 3 month old baby, then to a certain extent, the thing that you're grieving is the life that you were hoping for, all these expectations that have been shattered. So I would think that at a funeral or at a memorial, the thing that perhaps the grievers, the mourners would want to talk about is they'd want to share those things, those hopes and those aspirations that they had. Yeah, there might be a little bit, the baby was doing this or that at the age of a month or 6 weeks, but probably more of it at that point is what they were hoping for. The loss that they're experiencing is the loss about the potential, about the future. So I would want to create a container to allow the mourners to be able to express that, if that's where they would want to go. But that's what I would kind of open up.
Well, I think your approach of asking questions is a good one, because you can, from my perspective, someone asks me a question, I can always kind of give them the, yes, totally, like, of course. But, or I can give them, the whole, like, oh my God, like, let me tell you all about that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's also true.
No, and I, when I joined the congregation that I joined, there's also this piece of, your community may not know, like the community I lived in when Aiden died was one community. So they showed up with me in a certain way. And now I'm showing up in a brand new way with this kind of dead child and alive child. And it's like, well, how do you talk about it when no one knows and introduce the topic to like an entire population? Because like you said, so much of the Jewish component of grieving is communal support. Well, if you move to a community where they don't know that you're grieving, how can you give them the opportunity to play their role? And you also need the support too, like ongoing. So it's complicated. And I used Judaism as a tool to start that conversation in the way that I had done it, because I think there are a lot of natural avenues where you could talk about loss. But I can imagine as part of like you're doing intake with people when they move to the community, is that something you ask? Is that something you make note of? Like if there's someone new who's coming in, do you ask about their losses? Like how do you integrate that into welcoming new people into your community? It probably hasn't come up that often. I don't know.
Yeah, but obviously this is wonderful. This is a good takeaway for me to go back to my community and figure out a way to do that and really try to make that part of the welcoming in process of new members, because everyone has things. And even just even I don't even think we have this, but even just a question on the application form, as people are signing up or during the first time, is there anything that you would like us to know about you, about your past that could help us help you or be there
we
for
really like the question, like, tell us about your family, as opposed to how many children do you have?
Yes.
I think that's a much easier way to kind of share the whole scope of your situation. It's an open-ended, much more open-ended question.
Yeah, I actually really do like that phrasing of tell me about your family. Okay, I have one more question, and I think this one's a little touchy, but we're going to do a dance and try our best.
Go for it.
Okay, so in Judaism, there's a lot of prescribed gender roles, like certain traditions and certain rituals are led by men. Our community is mostly, I don't want to speak, we do have some dads, but mostly mothers. And I guess I'm curious about, is there space for mothers is there as much space for mothers as there are for fathers? Like, does that gender role play a role in how to participate in the Jewish acts of grieving? Yes or no? I know that's like kind of a complicated question, but I guess the way I think about it is I think in many communities, the man is the one who maybe takes like the lead. I don't know, on like ritual and like not Jewish observance, but like the men have a lot more obligation. I don't know. You know what I'm trying to say, but I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, I mean, well, so I'm a rabbi of an Orthodox synagogue. So the synagogue is not egalitarian. We have men and women pray on separate sides of the of the synagogue. We have separate seating, and we have almost most of the ritual things that are done in synagogue are led by men. That's
what I was trying to ask.
We're an Orthodox synagogue, so that's only true about Orthodox Judaism. If you go to conservative or Reform Judaism, it would not be that way. The other denominations, the more liberal denominations. But that being said, I think that when it comes specifically the topic of the conversation that we've been having was around rituals of mourning, things are almost the same. First of all, most of the mourning rituals happen at home, right? After someone passes away, the shiva is in the home. People come and visit, and there are no gender distinctions around any of the rules of shiva. Men and women have to observe shiva the 7-day period, and then the 30-day period, and then the year period, the same way. Now, it's true that oftentimes during the first year, people will come to synagogue and they'll recite this Kaddish prayer, this prayer that's said by mourners in the synagogue, and they'll lead the services as well. And so for leading the services, that's something that in our synagogue would only be available for men, but for saying the Kaddish, both men and women say Kaddish. On the yard site, the day of the death, the anniversary of the death, both men and women come and say Kaddish. So while it's true that in general, Orthodoxy definitely has very, very defined gender roles. The synagogue that I'm a rabbi of is probably on the very progressive end of Orthodoxy. So we're kind of pushing a lot of those boundaries to the extent that we can. But it is true that we are Orthodox synagogue. But it happens to be that I've never thought about this question, but around the rules of mourning and grieving, there really aren't that many gender distinctions. That's an interesting thing to think about. The actual basic rules of mourning, they're the same for men and women.
I actually agree. I think that's 100% true. The one thing I will add as a caveat to that is that I think that men know more about, like, as a woman, there are certain things that I didn't even know because I didn't participate in those. For example, Orthodox for a minute, like the thing about on the Shabbos before, like in Mincha, what is that called?
Kel Male, the memorial prayer. Kel Male.
Kel Male. I didn't know that was a thing. And even one thing I've learned is that, like, I'll never forget when Aiden was buried, like my husband knew the entire Kaddish by heart, and he would say it so fast. This always came up. Like, they say it fast. They say it so fast. And because I'm not in shul every day, like, it doesn't come as naturally. And there are just certain, like, things I didn't know that you're supposed to, that you can say a couple words about the deceased, on the day of their yortzeit. Like, there's so many, like, small, like, things that sometimes men know because they're just in the space more that I feel like I would have never have known.
Even if it's not a kind of a formal rule that makes a distinction between men and women, but because men
definitely not formal. It's not formal.
Right. But since men are more commonly in those spaces, they might have more access to the information and the tools that can be used.
That's really interesting.
I also think that when given those opportunities, like, they feel really empowering. Like, I think even the act of leading the service, like just the Kalmal, all those little things I have found are empowering, and I like knowing that they're open to me. I don't have to do them.
Right.
But I like that there's agency in it, that I can choose to do it.
For sure.
And that feels really comforting and good to me. And I've always appreciated it. And the first year that it was Aiden's yortzeit, I don't even know why I was asked. I actually think, I don't know who asked. I think that someone asked if my husband wanted to speak at Sudah Shishit. And then I said, I'll do it. And I'll never forget when I said in that room, like I said, I'm here to talk about my son who died as a baby. There's like this, it was first of all a room of only men in their 60s. Like, there were no women there. It was like me and a bunch of men in their 60s. And there was like this audible gasp. And I was reminded that I'm an anomaly, but I also felt so honored that I was given that opportunity to speak about Aiden in those spaces that he's not normally a part of. You know,
Yeah.
like I think that's where Judaism does it right, where you create space to bring the deceased into the living world again and again and again, whether it's saying Yisker or whether it's whatever it is, there's space for me to talk about him in a communal setting so everyone can learn about him.
Yeah.
And I don't think Alina has that in the same way that I do. Alina doesn't have formal spaces to talk about her son.
And this leads into what I think is my last question. It's a bit of a semantics question, but I've noticed you, Rabbi Antine, use the word mourning a lot. And we never, I would say almost never use the word mourning. We very frequently use the word grieving. And at first glance, they seem the same. However, I think the word mourning, you know, we've actually talked about this in the Crisis of Faith episode, I think, actually, Judith. Mourning being the public expression of that grief, the grief you kind of share in your community, whereas grief feels something like that happens inside. And so we talk about grief a lot, but I think this conversation has been about opportunities for mourning. And I don't know that outside of a religious community, you get a lot of opportunities to mourn, with the exception of maybe the funeral, right? But there's really no other opportunity, I don't think. And what you're talking about is really a way that Judaism presents so many opportunities for mourning and remembering how important that person was publicly, with not just you and your little contained family, but in your whole community. And I think it's really beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think of Nancy? What do you think about the?
It's interesting. I almost exclusively would use the word mourning because that's the way that our Hebrew word avelut is oftentimes translated, and it does connote more of a public form of mourning, and a ritualized one. And I agree with you that grief is really more an expression of what's in the heart and what people are actually feeling, and sometimes the grief is not reflective of the mourning period. Like, for instance, mourning periods, they have numbers, 7 days. That's an arbitrary number. And then it changes to a lower or a lesser form of intensity until 30 days. And then a lesser intensity until the end of the year. Those are the 3 periods, 7 days, 30 days, and a year. Well, what if somebody's grief is actually 5 days, and then 7 months, and then 4 years? Like, so what do we say? No, it stops right now. You have to stop. Well, mourning, it does stop, but the grief goes on. So we just have to so I always have to remind myself that, people's actual experience in their heart is not necessarily going to conform to the mourning rituals, the external ways. But I still think it's really important to have the external ones. And I'll give an example. Let's say, for instance, one of the things that mourners do is on the yard site, on the year anniversary, they do. Now, you might not be feeling anything at that moment if it's just about the heart. Or let's say Yisker, right? Yisker would be a kind of like a mourning ritual, a memory ritual that's done during the holidays. So at particular holidays, in the middle of Passover, it's the last day of Passover, you might not be feeling something in that moment, but you come to synagogue and there's this like public way of actually experiencing it. And then people do find that they have very, very meaningful experiences in that context. So I think it's important to both have the structured mourning and then also to allow the grief, and not to pressure yourself to make sure that the grief lines up with the mourning and the mourning lines up with the grief, because they're not necessarily. And then that's an interesting thing. That's a real tough job of community, because community knows how to do the mourning part, but do they know how to be there for the grieving part? Let's say the grieving goes on. One of the episodes I listened to was, I forgot what your title was, but something basically, isn't it time? Isn't it enough?
It was trauma, blah, blah.
What was it?
Trauma, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, exactly.
Trauma.
I listened to that. I listened to that episode, and I'm like, wow, we have. And I was thinking about this, like we've got, it's already, your year is up. Your mourning period is up. No, it's not necessarily going along with that. So then the question is, can community members, can friends and loved ones realize and remember that this is just a structure that's there to help us begin. It's just the beginning.
Right.
The grief is going to continue or take on different shapes, and we got to be there.
The grief continues as long as the love lasts, which is forever.
Yes.
That's what we always say.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation.
Oh my God. I have loved this conversation. I can't even tell you. And I don't know if you probably think I'm insane. First of all, is it weird, Rabbi Antine, that I know so much about something that I don't participate in at all?
She knows a lot. I've taught her well.
It's so beautiful. You get that you guys have connected so much on so many things, and even to be able to share faith practices and learn from each other around
My
them.
22 years of formal Jewish education all resulted in Alina's education here.
In all seriousness, I have learned a lot about grieving, about mourning, about ritual, and all of that from my friendship with Judith as a Jewish person. And I really respect all of just the way you guys handle things. Obviously, nobody's perfect, and there are some things that you guys could improve on. But I think overall, you have the right idea, and that's an area where I wish I had that background in some cases. I feel like I wish I had it, because I don't think I could have joined after and really felt that same, sense of whatever. But it's a really beautiful thing.
I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
I think people are going to really enjoy learning this.
Yeah. I'm so grateful for what you've done. As I mentioned, I listened to some of the podcasts, and just for you guys taking your grief, and I'm sure it just started because you wanted to talk and needed to talk for yourself.
Yes.
But to be able to share that with other people who are going through it, it's just so important. So I'm really
a little less lonely.
Yes,
exactly.
To all of our wonderful new friends, we want to hear from you. Email us at aslongasimlivingpodcast@gmail.com and follow us on Instagram at aslongasimlivingpodcast. We'll get back to you as soon as our grieving brains allow.
Yay!